to the semester this year, but we're excited to kick this off. We're moving back to sort of a monthly schedule rather than the weekly schedule we had done in the past. And we are so excited to have Dr. McCarty from Miami University give our first talk during this reincarnation of our seminar series. And so Dr. McCarty is an associate professor of geography and director of the Geospatial Analysis Center at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. And she has more than 15 years of experience doing remote sensing and geospatial science to quantify wild and human-caused fires, fire emission, agriculture, food security, and land cover and land use change. And so Dr. McCarty's been, I think, all over the news a bit in the fire world lately. She's been testifying to the US Congress, as well as being quite well known for McCarty et al., one of her papers quoted at conferences if you follow on Twitter. So I think we were actually introduced from some Twitter discussions, and she's been a great voice, not only for wildfire and zombie fires and the interesting science you're going to hear about Arctic fires today, but also just for maybe congeniality and how we should all get together and work in academia. So I'm very excited that we have her here to present to all of us today, and take it away.
Well, thanks so much, Michael. It's nice to be here and to be invited. And I am calling in from Oxford, Ohio, where it's just started to snow. So it is beginning to feel a lot like Christmas. So it's probably a good time to start talking about future Arctic fire regimes. So today I am going to focus on science first, and then look at the nexus of policy and diplomacy. So basically, how did I end up being an international scientist? Most of you know this figure, or some version of this figure. This is adapted from Phil Higuera's work, where he was looking at ways to conceptualize fire regimes. And why I share this is that in the science policy nexus, while fire regimes are really important and fire behavior as a model or potentially for a single event is asked about by decision makers, often what they really want to know are fire emissions. So they want to know the quantity, the transport, and the rate. And that space and time continuum, while it overlaps with fire behavior and fire regimes, of course, feed into it, we're really talking about months and years. We're talking about individual counties, towns, to whole regions like the Pan-Arctic. So it gets pretty complex pretty quickly. And honestly, it gets political and a lot of bureaucracies pretty quickly. So as we continue to talk about this today, just keep that in mind. Now, why do we care about smoke or fire in the high northern latitudes? Well, going back about a decade, this working group with the Arctic Council, AMAP, which is the Arctic Monitoring and Assessment Program, started to notice that some foundational work that was done in the late 1990s and the early 2000s in Alaska and Canada and in Siberia showed that there was an accumulation of black carbon, particularly from smoke transport. And that these powerful climate forcers, though they remain in the atmosphere for a much shorter time than carbon dioxide, had a great potential to warm the atmosphere. And in particular, they were really important for Arctic sea ice. And so that's what this is showing here. During transport in late winter, all the way into basically the beginning of summer. So in the high northern latitudes, that would be closer to middle of June. We have this potential of smoke from the mid latitudes to be transported at a low level, so below the tropopause or even just above the tropopause, which is about 8 kilometers above the surface of the Earth, to the Arctic. And when this is deposited on sea ice, what that means is that sea ice is essentially experiencing an albedo effect. It's warming from the top, just as climate change is making it melt from all directions, right? So it's this doubling force. And it is from this context that a lot of the northern governments, so the Arctic governments and the Arctic Council, and that includes the countries of the US because of Alaska, Canada, Denmark because of Greenland and the Faroe Islands, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, Finland, and the Russian Federation, they started to note that fire activity was also increasing. While we knew of fire in Alaska and Canada, and of course in Siberia, which often makes the news, Fires were starting to be seen throughout Finlandia and the Nordic countries, and even in places like Greenland. So why do these small, often human-caused fires within or near the Arctic mean for black carbon transport? So why do we assume human-caused fires? Well, these early season fires are unlikely to be lightning because convective activity is quite rare before summer in the high northern latitudes. This actually shows wetland burning in Sakha Republic and the end of April of this year at 64.2 degrees. And we don't actually know the source of this ignition. I have looked through a lot of the Russian official statistics. And these types of fires that occur early in the spring are often not documented. And we'll get to that. They can also impact air quality. So this is a thermal karst wetland. Isn't this just a beautiful landscape? This is in Omsk in central Siberia. And these fires were started actually by agricultural burning, which you can see towards the bottom of your screen. These agricultural fields in this river valley as it transitions into this thermal karst wetland area. And it just spread, right? So that actually caused some of the worst air quality of the year for Novosibirsk and Omsk. And Novosibirsk is the science city in Russia. So this is a really famous university and research city within Siberia. And as early as April, they were experiencing essentially air quality days. They call them lock-in days or air lock-in days from the smoke, not because of COVID, but because it was too hard to breathe outside. If we look at some of the modeling that's been done by the Copernicus Atmosphere Monitoring Service, this is approximately the location of the fires in Omsk. And 24 hours later, that smoke from that location has only made it to about 60 degrees north. So we're talking like these are the boreal regions, but not necessarily the Arctic. We know that human-caused fires in the spring are often driven by human activity. So this was work actually led by Tina Liu at Harvard University. And she looked at ways to attribute human influence on these shifting fire patterns. So for the work in Southwest Russia, what we found was that fires that had normally occurred in February, March, and April that are associated with a spring wheat harvest were now shifting to the summer. And this had occurred over an almost 13-year period. So what had happened exactly? Well, because of some intervention by the Russian government, by non-governmental organizations, and through multilateral agreements on the reduction of black carbon, as we talked about previously, to switch to no-till, no-burn technology in Southwest Russia, like Krasnodar Krai, farmers had actually adapted new techniques that meant that they didn't have to burn to harvest this winter crop in the spring. But we also found some impact of the economic fallout of 2008, which shifted commodity markets to later in the year that basically stayed permanent. And so it was these two-pronged things, this changing in fire use by farmers in order to reduce black carbon because of efforts of these Arctic nations, Arctic states, sorry, as well as this economic incentive to have larger wheat harvests later in the year. So they were essentially switching up crops and switching harvest practices as well. So I want to focus a little bit on these fires. So this is near Oymyakon in Sakha Republic. The Oymyakon is famous for being one of the coldest places on Earth. It sometimes is called the ice box of the world, or the ice chest of the world. It has some of the coldest temperatures at night. I was reading recently from a National Geographic article about Oymyakon from about 10 years ago, and they were saying that in the winter, parents don't let their children outside to play if it's really, really windy, because it's so cold that if they get blown down or blown away from their houses, that there's not enough time to find them before the temperatures become dangerous to them. So I wanted to emphasize how cold it is here, but also that there's a high fire activity. So if we look at those small fires, and these are all PD areas, wetland areas that are within the kind of shift from taiga, the boreal forest, to the Arctic, to the tundra. So here again, let's look at our black carbon estimates, our PM 2.5 and black carbon estimates from the CAMS group. This is exactly 3 hours later. So plus 2 hours then, 4, 6, 8. And within 48 hours, those small wetland fires that we were seeing were predicted to both transport and likely to deposit in the East Siberian Sea sea ice. So if we look now at this GIF that Dr. Zach Labe at Colorado State University shared on Twitter, and I'm going to give him all credit for this. This is his GIF. What we will find is, let me go ahead and play this GIF before I use the laser pointer. This is the East Siberian Sea. So by the middle of April, we're already seeing breakup of sea ice. And by the end of April, we're already seeing transport of black carbon to this area with predicted black carbon deposition. And remember, this is one of the coldest places on Earth, and yet we're still seeing this very active springtime fire regime. So because of that, one of the things that I've had the pleasure to do is to work with my colleagues at Greenpeace Russia in Moscow. And this was work led by Igor Gushkov and Ilona Zuraleva. And here what we did was crowdsourcing of high resolution Sentinel-2 data, where we looked at every image between January 1st of 2020 through May 15th of 2020 to try to hand map every burned area we can find for the entire Russian Federation that was outside the Arctic, because we wanted to be able to see which fires might be missed by our active fire data, by our global burned area products that are at a coarser spatial resolution, but also to try to understand these springtime regimes. So we estimated that, or we found from this data, about 13.4 million hectares of burning. So in context, the 2020 Russia spring fires, that's about 33 million acres. If we compare that to the CAL FIRE and US Forest Service estimate of burned area in California for 2020, which was a significant year, of about 4.1 million acres. And this year, through the beginning of November, that's almost 2.5 million acres. So this is one of my favorite slides that I've ever made, but basically this is essentially burning an area larger than Alabama, but not quite Arkansas, every spring. And burning lots of interesting landscapes that we would normally not attribute to fire regimes in Russia. So why we found that agricultural lands, arable lands, were of course one of the main sources, and we had known that from previous work in Russia. They're not the only source of burning. In fact, wetlands, so peat areas, and abandoned lands, so lands that had been under agricultural production during the times of the Soviet Union, but had been abandoned after perestroika in 1991, are also significant sources of springtime burning. Now, most abandoned land has converted into basically unmanaged forests, not quite timber, because often the species are considered trash trees. It would not be harvested for timber, though some have recently been converted. What I would note is here in European Russia, if we focus on the Moscow Oblast, we find that actually most of it is abandoned arable land. So this was previously essentially collective agriculture that has now been abandoned. And that is what we see, almost 50% of that is burning every spring. In order to do both the crowdsource and the validation, Greenpeace built this really awesome application. So I wanted to show you what it looks like. And also to highlight some of the interesting landscapes that we found. But in particular, we found a lot more wetland burning and reed burning, essentially, than we had estimated. And so while previously, so this is actually near Krasnodar, This is in the Rostov Oblast. We find that there's a lot of burning in the wetlands between agricultural fields. And oftentimes in previous studies, including some of my own work with Russian colleagues, we had attributed this to agricultural burning, when in fact, it's clear that it's this land that's in between that's not being managed. Though there are, of course, still actually cropped fields being burned as well during this time. And so this is a complexity that had not been teased out in a previous study. And honestly, it surprised all of us. And all of us have been working, and some of us have been living in Russia for a long time and knew about reed burning, but had not seen it at quite this scope. So why map spring fires in Russia? Well, if you download our supplemental data for our recently published article in Environmental Research Letters, one of the things we did is we spent a lot of time actually taking published policy passed by the Duma, the Russian parliament, that's in Russian, and translating it into English so that we can share how forest fire monitoring and both fire monitoring, so not just forest fires, but all fire monitoring are done in Russia. And one of the things we found essentially is that at the region, essentially, aerial and field survey data are collected, but not ground data. Federal agencies are often looking at controlled zones. So there are uncontrolled areas, mainly in Siberia and the Arctic and Far East, where they're just too far from where people live, that essentially if there's a fire there, they let it burn. And a similar process is actually done in Alaska and Canada, but under different regulations. And of course, they're watched in all countries, but oftentimes they're left to burn. And then, of course, the federal service, which collects the data. As far as the fire data goes, essentially, the fire service is collecting information on structures, so buildings, or people that may have been harmed. The federal ministries are looking at those responsible for the settlements, and then the statistics are being collected on what property, including timber, may have been burned or damaged during the fires. But spring fires fall outside of this. They're not during the summer fires when normally timber, structures, and people are at risk. They're not within controlled zones because they often are in areas of agriculture and wetlands and abandoned lands that are not controlled. And so essentially, these are orphans. No one is including these estimates in their official statistics. And no one is mapping these with remote sensing data explicitly. And so that was one of the reasons we wanted to look at it, because with future Arctic fire regimes, one of the things we need to get a handle on is how much black carbon is being deposited from anthropogenic burning, not just these extreme summer fire seasons that we've been seeing. Which means also that this data, this 13.4 million hectares that we find, this is not being reported by the Russian government to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, so the UNFCCC, because it's not included in their official statistics per their own legislation. Therefore, it's not being used by the IPCC and its modeling, and it would not be a part of the negotiations, pledges, or resolutions that were made at any conference of party, including the most recent COP26. So it is really important actually to understand the entire fire regime and fire season, and not just the one, right, that makes the news and makes everybody uncomfortable in the summer, or scared, I would say scared. Which leads me to some of the work that I've been doing with the Arctic Monitoring and Assessment Program, which is a working group of the Arctic Council. This is our expert group on short-lived climate forcers, and we were actually tasked by the 8 Arctic states to come up with what future Arctic fire regimes would look like for the mid to late 21st century. And one of the things that I thought was really important in our working group, we actually had no participants or representation from Russia. And so when we were ready to take the chapter, which is being published at the end of this year, beginning of January, document by the Arctic Council, so a government document. When we wanted to submit it for peer review, which is required of all our chapters, I insisted that we add Russian expertise because it didn't make sense to talk about Arctic fire regimes when so much of the Arctic fire is within the Russian Federation. And so you'll see here, two of my colleagues that are in the Sukachev Institute of Forests and the Siberian branch of the Russian Academy of Sciences, Nadja Chepakova and Yelena Parfanova were added as co-authors and really did contribute a massive understanding of ecosystem shifts, of what future landscapes in Siberia look like, and also just current issues and controversies about fire regimes throughout Russia, because we needed that expertise. And so, we want to talk about science, policy, and diplomacy today. You can't talk about the Arctic and leave out any of the Arctic states, right? So we needed to have that representation. So what did we find? Essentially, we found that future Arctic fire risk and fire regimes are increasing. And North America and Eurasia, and here I'm including Greenland as adjacent to North America because it is part of the Canadian Shield, though it is, of course, a colony of Denmark. Here we want to show that they often are essentially a mirror image, where we see boreal forest to grassland. We also see, taiga to tundra, where we see forest steppe to steppe. We see a similar boreal tundra zone or agricultural expanding north. We see agricultural expanding north in Siberia. We see taiga tundra zone to dry peat and boreal tundra zone to dry peat, right, in the same places. And what's really interesting is that in Eastern Canada and in the Nordic countries, we have seen both shift from coniferous to deciduous, even though the timber industries are trying to prevent this, that has reduced fire risk. What is unique are, of course, Alaska is one of the few places where we have evidence of increased lightning strikes, though I would say this is fairly unsettled. There is not a scientific consensus yet, though we're gaining evidence to show that lightning is increasing. And particularly important is that Arctic indigenous peoples are telling us that lightning is increasing and helping aid in documentation of that. And then here in the Far East and in Siberia, we are seeing that there's a taiga to permafrost thaw to dry peat that has been documented in Sakha Republic and in a little farther south in the Far East near Vladivostok. And we're seeing this kind of pause. So when the permafrost does thaw, things become too wet for a while for fires. And then as they dry out, of course, the peat is a good fuel source. So some really quick synopsis. It's early and late to burn. We see a 13-day longer fire season. We're seeing fires earlier in the year. We're seeing fires last later in the year. The ones earlier and later in the year tend to be human caused, while the ones that are the largest fires in the summer tend to be lightning caused. Our long-term emissions are going up. So when we look at all of these global fire emission models, GFED, GFAS, and FEN, which are often included in IPCC reporting, are sometimes included in UNFCCC reporting, and are cited during COP negotiations. We see a consensus that there are more fires occurring above 60 degrees north than are occurring in the temperate zone since the mid-2000s. And this was a surprise to our working group, especially as we see this throughout Eurasia. We see this in the Nordic countries, and we see it in North America as well. It was nice to see in the Arctic report card produced by NOAA that they documented last year that fire fuels are increasingly flammable as well. So this may be one of the reasons that we're starting to see this increase in fire activity, as we're just starting to see an increase in flammable fuels earlier in the season. Fire emissions are also really important at high latitudes. So when we compare fire emissions from GFAS to anthropogenic sectors that are included in the ECLIPSE model, which is an anthropogenic, which is an atmospheric model that tries to include current legislation as well as, mitigation attempts for future climate change, we find that in 2010, 2015, and 2020, 2010 and 2015, we see similar black carbon emissions from fires as we do from intensive emission sources like natural gas extraction and flaring, which is orange. And in extreme years like 2020, they actually outpace natural gas expansion and flaring. So at these high northern latitudes, the fire emissions themselves may be much larger than the anthropogenic sources, even when we include things like natural gas extraction. We do see extended fire seasons and fire intensity throughout North America, globally, and in the Russian Federation. One of the things that we have seen, or that has been written about, and much of this work is coming from our Canadian colleagues, and is starting to be, I understand that UAF now has an EPSCoR fire and ice project, and they're going to start looking at things like what does climate change mean for fire management and wildland firefighting. And so here at by the end of the century, what Watton et al. Are reporting is that these 24 plus days of crown fires, right? So not surface fires, crown fires, which are hard enough to fight. But if you have 24 plus days, which is 3 weeks of more fires that are difficult to fight, that you can actually use management standards, wildland firefighting management standards, to understand the fire intensity and how that would then limit any kind of controls or wildland fire management. So at 2 megawatts per meter firelight intensity, you would need then to request aerial fire support just to hold the fire line. At 4, you would need aerial fire suppression via air tankers, and they would likely lose control. And at 10, there's just nothing is really effective that we have at holding the fire line. And these 24 days of crown fires, they are essentially somewhere between 4 and 10. So 4 megawatts and 10 megawatts per meter of fire energy that are being emitted. And this is mainly looking at fires in Canada, and then they did include a small portion of interior of Alaska. Another subsequent review found that there's a 1 in 4 chance of large tundra fires in Alaska by the end of the century. So Alaska does, fires in the tundra are not new. They've been a part of the system, but they're not frequent. They tend to have a longer fire return interval. So a 1 in 4 chance shortening that fire return interval is essentially speeding up the fire regime, which means it speeds up the emissions, right? The rate at which emissions are emitted. Policymakers wanted to know what could be managed. Of course, fuels can be managed, but that's complicated. And why? Well, mainly it's complicated because fuels management requires people. And in the Arctic, which is one of the most indigenous places in the world, that means an emphasis on indigenous and local leadership. And so that, like in other parts of the world, can be complicated and can be political. And so it also means that we have competing economic interests. Timber, energy, and tourism, these sectors have all been sources of ignitions. In fact, in 2017 and 2019, both of the wildfires in Greenland were started by tourists. So that is, and Greenland is very dependent upon tourism for its economy and wants to reopen for tourism post-COVID. So they're going to have to adapt to essentially what was a landscape that was unlikely to burn to a landscape that is now, more likely to burn. There is some controversy, but also some collaboration around cultural burning. So indigenous burning in the Arctic. I'll have a little bit later showing my my colleagues at Witching Council International are really, they're taking the lead. So really all credit to them. That's not my work. These zombie overwintering or holdover fires, these are essentially timed together fire seasons, right? So it's a fire from last summer or last fall that burns down in the peat, and the blanket of snow lets it live through the winter, and then it burns up to the top in the spring, which is why it's called a zombie, because we thought the fire was dead, but it's not. We are now using some remote sensing methods. I can tell you that within Sakha Republic and in Krasnoyarsk, the local populations are starting to look for these fires more often. They're starting to notice them more often, but they're also starting to look for them because they are concerned that they're happening more often. And then all of this means that within each country, so within these 8 Arctic states, but then also across the Pan-Arctic, there's going to be efforts to work together on Arctic wildland firefighting policy and infrastructure. But of course, not all of these countries are necessarily friends. And so there will be some competition, there will be disagreements, but the Arctic is a shared space. And if one country is not on board with preserving it, then the other 7 countries are out of luck. So hopefully this is an arena where some collaboration and some moderation, right, can be done. So let's talk a little bit about zombie fires, and I want to really highlight the work that Rebecca Schulten and Randy Jan, Eric Miller, Brendan Rogers, and Sander Rebecca have been doing. Here they look at Northwest Territories and Alaska, where they're looking at using remote sensing methods combined with really good ground data. And I think that's important to understand. Really good ground data, where they've been able to have ground reports of overwintering fires and then link that to remote sensing data. And now another researcher in Sanders' group is also trying to replicate this for Sakha Republic, where we have less good ground data, but we have some good ground data. And so this will help us now understand this contribution of the overwintering fires, both to fire activity, to peak consumption, to permafrost thaw, and as well as emissions. And we estimate, this work estimated that somewhere between 0.5% to as much as 8% of all emissions from peat are coming from overwintering fires in these 2 areas. So it's, and the higher the emissions are during extreme years, or actually following extreme fire years. So they are important to quantify for emissions models and potentially for emission inventories. The difference here being that emission models are things that scientists and analysts come up with, and emission inventories are government approved inventories. So along those lines, one of the things we also wanted to do was was to gather actually all the official statistics of burned area for essentially circa 2019, because that was the date the Arctic Council told us to look at, to stop at year 2019. And so we have official statistics from all 8 Arctic states. And what we found is that if we compare that to satellite-based burned area, and here we decided on using GWIS, which is the Global Wildfire Information System. And what GWIS is, it creates burned area from MODIS and VIIRS active fire, where it delineates polygons, and then also uses MODIS burned area, and it combines that together in a fusion product. So that's what that burned area product is. And this is funded by ESA, European Space Agency, NASA, and the Group on Earth Observations, or GEO. So if we just look at 3 Nordic countries, what we will find is that there's an overestimation from remote sensing data from Norway and Finland by quite a bit. But then there's an underestimation in Sweden by 50%. So, so there's really no agreement here. And the policy, I can tell you that this section of the book, of the chapter, was what the policymakers really picked on the most. I think that they were expecting that the future was not going to be good for Arctic fire regimes and emissions. They did not like that the official statistics were so different than the satellite-based estimates, because they had often thought that satellite-based estimates would be better. So I want to show an example from this year. This is Kalajoki, Finland, and this actually translates, by the way. Kala is fish in Finnish, and Joki is river. So it's fish river. So this is Kalajoki, Finland, and it burned officially about 299 hectares, so about 300 hectares. This was a record hot and dry summer, and this started at the end of July, and it burned through the beginning of August. So here we have when the fire starts, the 27th of July, and then when it ends on the 31st of July. So if you hand digitize this, which I did several times in QGIS just to get an average, what I have an average polygon here of approximately 230 hectares using Sentinel-2 imagery, but that's much less than a 300 hectare estimate by the officials. And when I looked for a leaf off image, it's not very helpful here because these are mainly coniferous forests because of timber interests. And so we're underestimating even using the higher resolution data. If we look at MODIS and VIIRS, we find that both of these systems were able to detect the active fire. But if we were to assume whole pixel or the polygon burned, we actually get twice as much area as the official statistics. So we're still in this learning situation, and really that's where we have to move forward. In 2022 is to do this kind of hard work. How are we going to relate the remote sensing models to the official statistics? And we also need to think about how we can properly convey Indigenous cultural burning in the Pan-Arctic and its benefits, as well as its emission sources. Because it's not that there aren't emission sources, of course there are, but the benefits may outweigh the emission sources. And that's actually where I think that that kind of collaboration, but being led by the Arctic Permanent Participants is definitely better. So why would you burn this landscape? Well, in the short term, if you get a big fire, that reindeer there is digging through the snow to get the reindeer lichen. That big fire, well, that decreases all that lichen, which means no more reindeer, no more caribou. But if you do a small fire and a bunch of small fires over a long term, you get this nice open forest and you get a lot of lichen, which is exactly what that reindeer wants. And in fact, some work done in Sweden working with the Sami found that the Sami have known for a long time that burning can promote summer pastures and maintain long-term availability of winter pastures, even though it destroys the lichen pasture temporarily. And so this is kind of a big deal in Nordic countries that the Sami indigenous knowledge on burning is being recognized as an important way to maintain reindeer populations and habitat. And just a quick side note, the word Rova, which is a Sami word, has been adopted in Swedish, Norwegian, and Finnish. So think of a city, Rovaniemi, where Santa Claus lives in Finland, right? That means a place that has burnt in the Sami language. So it's even there. So if you go and map, there's another study that just mapped places named Rova. And there's so many, and those are probably places where cultural burning was done. Work being led by the Gwich'in Council International here, Edward Alexander, who is the co-chair of the Gwich'in Council International in Fairbanks, Alaska, and Devlin Fernandez, and she's the chair of the Gwich'in Council International in Yellowknife, Northwest Territories. They talk about how the Gwich'in cultural practice is to burn early springtime when there's still snow line in the timber, but the meadows are open. And why? Because these small burns mean that caribou go up. But late season burns usually mean that the habitat is such that the caribou will not return, right? So this is food security, right? All right. So which leads me to the last bit before we open up discussion. I wanted to talk about the science policy and diplomacy. And this is a bit of a joke. Like, if people who know me IRL in real life would not say that I'm a very diplomatic person, because I'm not. So, but for this type of work, one must check themselves and try to, be here in this intersection of science, policy, and diplomacy. So why? Well, the Arctic Council is 8 Arctic states, plus 6 permanent Indigenous participants, including the Aleut International Association, the Arctic Athabascan Council, the Gwich'in Council International, the Inuit Circumpolar Council, RAPON, which is the Russian Association of Indigenous Persons of the North, and the Sami Council. So we're talking 6 Indigenous nations and 8 Arctic states. And as you can see, many observers, member states, as well as members and or permanent observers and ad hoc observers. So one can very quickly put one's foot in one's mouth if you're not careful about how you do your work or how you comport yourself. So how does one work in this complex Arctic fire regimes? Well, one of the things that you have to do is, help with collaboration. So here, just a couple weeks ago, I was privileged enough to help plan and host the Arctic Wildland Fire Sharing Circle, which was led by the Glitching Council International and 2 other Arctic Council working groups, CAF, which is the Conservation of Arctic Flora and Fauna, and EPPR, which is the Emergency Prevention and Preparedness and Response Working Group. And in doing this, I was simply the host and facilitator and cat herder, right? Trying to get everyone to talk. But I did not present. My science was not a part of this. It was not about me. It was about linking other people. It was about being a scientific matchmaker, which is a really important job that you have to do if you want to work in an international setting. And I even had the privilege of introducing Ambassador Nikolai Korchnov, who is the chair of the senior Arctic officials. Russia holds the chairmanship of the Arctic Council for 2021, 2022, and 2023. Every state holds it for 2 years on a rotating basis. And you know, it just means kind of being able to step back from your role as a scientist and kind of a hustler of your own field, and to highlight other people's work because it's important. So how does one interact as an international scientist? These are just 3 rules that I have. Assume other people know things too, right? So what do I know? I know fire. I know Russia as well as anyone can know Russia who is not Russian, and how could anyone ever truly know Russia in a lifetime? But I do know it. I know how to work there. And I understand the landscapes. I've been there a lot. I've done field seasons. I have close colleagues. And every scientist I meet from around the Pan-Arctic, from our observer countries, I assume that they know things that I don't know, right? So it's good. It's good to know what you know and assume that other people know things too. You got to trust the process. There's a lot of formalities, bureaucracies, and protocols that you have to learn. People interact differently. What is polite to you or what is manners to you is not to someone else, which also means that you need to learn your stereotypes. And so what I mean is that people will tell you about their country's stereotypes as like a way to break the ice, or to tell jokes. And you have to understand cultural context to be a part of those conversations, and to get to know people on a more personal level. So I have 2 funny stories, short stories about this. The first one is that Russians assume that anyone who smiles is an idiot. So anyone who smiles in public is probably a fool. And so I have a non-smiling Russia face when I need to. But also I just let people assume that I'm a fool. And so they say things around me that they might not if they didn't think that I was. And so that's a good way to learn new things, is to allow people, is to to use stereotypes in your in your favor. And then also kind of the flip side of that coin is that people think Americans smile a lot. So my Finnish colleagues think I smile a lot, but I'm not like a super positive person. If you know me in real life, I would say I'm a pragmatist, but I'm not an optimist, and that confuses them. And so it's there's a little bit of hand holding there to make sure that they understand that, like, I'm smiling because I'm doing this to be polite and not because I'm happy, if that makes sense, because they think I'm being happy and I'm not necessarily. I'm trying to be polite, and we're taught to smile and we're polite. So knowing these stereotypes, knowing other people's assumptions, understanding their assumptions, and learning to check your own are good processes in which to work internationally. And of course, it's interesting. I mean, I'm a geographer. It's really interesting to learn about other people and other places. So that's also a good, curiosity is a good thing to have. All right. And with that, I'd like to open up for discussion and questions. And I'm going to stop sharing. Thanks, everybody.
And of course, I jump on with a big old smile because I know how to too. I have a super quick question. So first of all, I just wanted to remind people that we are doing a little bit differently than we had in the past. So we're not going to have the extra hour of discussion. So this is your time to get your questions into the Q&A. How do you learn these stereotypes though? Like, do you just have to kind of ask them, or do you Google them, or?
Oh, they'll tell you in jokes or stories or drinking when you're drinking. Yeah. So I know, I think I saw on the participants list, let's see, I think she's there. I think I saw on the, oh, sorry, on the attendees list. Yeah, Sue Connor, who's retired U.S. Force, done a lot of work in Siberia. But she could probably also tell us a lot, but you learn over time. They'll tell you jokes and you'll realize that like you're missing some cultural context, and it's because you don't know a stereotype about something, you know, and sometimes that they are not politically correct, or you may find them offensive. And I would say you do not have to laugh at them. You can just be like, oh, very interesting, and then learn it, and then learn to avoid it is what I would say moving forward. So you do have to do, like, I guess follow the protocols, follow the processes. They're, you know, I remember when COVID first happened, a lot of my Nordic colleagues were like, oh, I can't believe we have to do a virtual meeting. It'd just be so nice if we could have an evening break and all have a glass of champagne together and work out this problem that way. And I thought, okay. Right, like, when it was just like was such a good encapsulation of, like, you know, the difference in cultures. So yeah, but it's hard. Yeah. Should I answer the ones in the chat, or Stacy, do you want to read them?
Sure, I know we have one from Michael. Michael, do you want to ask your question?
Sure, and then I think there's another one too. So yeah, my question was, you mentioned that there can be a lot of fires that are missed in the satellite readings. And I was wondering, is that because of smoldering fires which are missed? I know that there's also some issues, you know, because it's not seeing the flames, or the timing of the satellite passes, or are there other effects we're missing? And I know you're doing a lot of, you know, you're trying to get field studies, yes, as hard as that is in Russia. Like, what can we do about that?
I mean, it's I think that, well, I mean, Crystal's here. There's a lot of people who've studied this in North America as well. And it is the things that you said. It's the satellite overpass. It's the smoldering. It's the fires that are occurring under the tree canopy. But it's also, you know, the springtime fires are really difficult because there's a lot of cloud cover. There's intermittent snow cover. So a fire will burn and we may get just a single burned area image before the next snow. And then by the time the snow melts, you really can't see it anymore. And then you don't want to delineate it. And at the Sentinel resolution, it's fine to kind of get that half burned area, but Landsat is too coarse, MODIS is too coarse, VIIRS is too coarse. And the commercial platforms are not free, you know, and they're not daily. So not at these latitudes. So we don't have that type of monitoring. And technically some of these fires are, they're not, well, they are legal. They're written into the Russian laws as illegal, but they're not necessarily repercussions for them. It's just kind of, you know, it's done at a very local or oblast cry level. And they're trying to be missed in a way as well. So the human caused fires are always difficult. I think early on, I remember when I was a graduate student in the early 2000s, I remember someone saying, it's a retired NASA official who will remain nameless, who said something like, all we really need to do is more outreach to people. If they just understood satellites better, then we'd be able to, you know, document a lot of what's happening on the Earth. And I remember thinking, but I was like a lowly grad student, I didn't say anything out loud, but I remember thinking like, oh no, they'll just learn how to rig the system. Like, you tell them enough about the satellites, they'll just figure out how to avoid them. And that's exactly what's happening. right? And so when we do outreach with some of the land managers, landowners, farmers in Russia, they're asking you how the satellites work because they want to avoid the satellites. So, which is, I mean, that's human nature. So, yes. So that's a lot. Yes, it's complicated. These are ever-changing systems, and in the springtime, sometimes they're burned and then plowed. The wetlands will burn and they'll re-green up really quickly. You know, so it is a difficult process. And that crowdsourcing, that was 700 volunteers that Greenpeace Russia had coordinated and trained individually to do this. And then I did not do the original mapping. I did months of validation instead, because we wanted to keep those people separate so that the validation was separate. So some of us never touched the original mapping. We only did the validation. Yeah.